Thank you for joining us in this forum on a virtual mode. Let's get started talking about seafarers. They normally work in shifts which range from 1 to 6 months, but the risk of the coronavirus has made crew changeovers more difficult, forcing them to remain on board their vessels indefinitely. So the two of the biggest challenges of the shipping industry today are the need for ships to change crews and for seafarers to fly home at the end of their periods. What is missing to have the IMO member states to follow the recommendations about measures to facilitate crew changes in seaports?
Mary Carmen, it's an excellent question, and this is indeed probably the single most critical COVID-19 related challenge that's facing the industry right now. Because without the men and women that crew these ships, and without being able to change crews so that we properly relieve those people, we can't operate, and that will have a negative impact on global trade. So this is really critical, and I appreciate the attention that you're putting to this issue. In terms of the things that still need to be done, you made reference to the IMO protocols, which were developed with industry, that were released, I think, on May 6th, they're dated May 5th. That was intended by the IMO to provide a basis for individual countries to then adopt their particular protocols that work in their countries to allow for crew changes. We're hoping to have as much consistency across countries as possible to keep things simple from a planning basis, but we also understand that different countries have different needs. And so in moving from the international guidance down to the level of actually opening national borders and providing pathways for seafarers to move if they're headed home off the vessel to the airport, etc., and then in the reverse when they get home, what has to happen is that officials in individual countries have to come up with their own plans. There needs to be coordination between the transport officials and the health officials to understand that it is possible both to facilitate crew changes and also to protect public health. And one of the bases of the IMO guidelines, for example, is to try to set up safe passage corridors for seafarers moving through countries so that they don't have much interaction with the general population. And so you reduce the risk both to the seafarers, who have had very little exposure while they're at sea, right? And also reduce any possible risk to the general population. So both can be accommodated, but it takes essentially a lot of very detailed work to figure out the steps. And that's where I think the IMO protocols are quite useful, because they demonstrate that it's possible to break up this seemingly very difficult challenge into a series of relatively easy to implement steps.
Okay. I would like to get, if you handle figures, information on how many seafarers have been caught on board, unable to leave their ships, or find themselves stuck in hotels without pay and unable to get flights home?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to get truly accurate numbers at any given time, but the numbers, and I think they're accurate, that the International Chamber of Shipping has been using, and the ICS has been doing a fantastic job in coordinating some of the international efforts. But at any given time, there are about 1.2 million seafarers on about 65,000 vessels in international trade. The numbers that we're hearing is that typically in any month, you might have about 150,000 seafarers that need to exchange or repatriate. You made reference earlier to the fact that many of these contracts have been extended. And so I think it's fair to say that typical number of 150,000 per month is now greater because we have, as contracts have been extended on top of each other, that's building up a larger pool of people that need to move and need to move soon.
Maritime authorities among different countries are issuing letters and circulars in support to the recommended framework of protocols endorsed by IMO. But also I see that health authorities are holding authorizations and airports remain closed. How can balance and agreement be reached among the different decision makers?
Now, it's an important question, and I alluded to it in passing a minute ago. It's clear that all of the officials in any given country that have control over the movement of people through that country have to get on the same page and have to agree that all of their objectives have to be met. And of course, we're very cognizant of the fact that all nations and all peoples are trying to keep their populations safe. But this is not a situation where you have to make a choice of keeping trade moving versus keeping the population safe. It's entirely possible to do both. Seafarers, frankly, because of the nature of their jobs, are relatively isolated, and they're a pretty low-risk population. But what the IMO protocols are designed to demonstrate is that with the proper steps, it's possible to move a crew member off of the ship through the seaport to an airport to fly home, and then a similar procedure once they reach home. With the proper steps in place, it's entirely possible to do that without exposing that seafarer unnecessarily and without providing any additional risk to the general population. So it's a matter of being careful and being deliberate about the procedures that you put in place. And in order for those things to happen, the transport officials and the health officials have to talk to one another. That's one of the things that we're pushing in countries around the world right now, is to try to make sure those conversations happen.
Specifically, Panama as regional hub should be the ones to be the first one of the countries to adopt these protocols?
Well, there are many countries around the world that are working with the protocols and adapting them to their own particular situation. And I have no doubt that Panama, as a leading maritime nation on several aspects, not only with the canal, but as a flag state, and it has a great deal of recognition and respect at the IMO. It would be fantastic if Panama emerges as a leader in facilitating crew changes. But what we're trying to do is to have that conversation every place at once, if you will. I will say, though, in direct response to your question, that where a leading maritime nation such as Panama is able to come forward and find a way to make this work, it would act as a tremendous example to the rest of the world to say, we know this is hard. We know that there are many challenges, but we have found a way to do it. And that, of course, is in the spirit of Panama, in the spirit of the way the canal has always been run, for example. And so it would be fantastic if we saw that sort of leadership.
John, thank you so much for your time and for granting us this interview. We really appreciate it.
The pleasure is all mine. I thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Take care.